Thank you, Chris, for the very kind introduction, and thanks to MS Canada for hosting this meeting. I know this is something that many of us have gotten used to coming to every few years, and we had a bit of a halt because of the pandemic, but really wonderful to see that we're back, and look forward to every couple of years coming together like this. So I've been told to strictly adhere to 18 minutes, and you will see me flipping through a lot of slides, but I really do want to leave some time for questions, so please do forgive me if I go through this a little bit more quickly than normal. And just wanted to give everybody an update on the Canadian prospective cohort study to understand progression in MS, or CanProCo. And just wanted to emphasize that I am doing this on behalf of the CanProCo investigators, which is a very large group of clinicians and scientists, many who are in the room today. And this is really a collective effort and would not be possible without the efforts of all 50 of our clinicians and scientists. Just trying to advance my slides, which are not going. Oh. Okay, so as many of you know, and many of the topics at NDMS and many of our scientific congresses in the last number of years have focused on a better understanding of progression in MS, which we are recognizing occurs across the entire spectrum of MS and not just in the later stages of MS or in progressive MS. And in order to do this, we need to understand the various factors that cause clinical progression, because this is not isolated to one factor. And this is really the overarching objective of CanProCo, which was an effort that was put together many, many years ago due to this recognition. And the overall goal is to evaluate a wide spectrum of factors associated with MS disease progression and to understand how these factors relate to one another to influence progression. So just to give you a brief history of CanProCo, this started way back in February of 2017, but actually started way before this, because it was only with discussions at meetings like this, hallway conversations between a number of people that recognized it might be useful to put together a large pocket of funding for Canada to establish a cohort where we could design a comprehensive study of people living with MS to answer important questions related to MS progression. So because of the efforts of many people, in February of 2017, there was a RFA issued from the MS Society of Canada that specifically challenged investigators in the country to design such a comprehensive study, and specifically using methods from 3 scientific pillars, which include epidemiology and health outcomes, neuroimaging, and neuroimmunology. So this is the timeline of what has happened since then. When that RFA was issued in February of 2017, a group of investigators, the CanProCo Executive Committee, came from around the country, and we worked for 10 months to put together what we thought was the best possible design to try to better understand the myriad of factors that lead to progression in MS. After that, during that time, we put together a simple application describing what we would be doing, and we're fortunate enough in July of 2017 to be awarded a planning grant for 10 months, and this was the time when we went through many different iterations of study designs that we thought would allow us to best understand progression, mechanisms of progression in MS with the resources that we had. And in February of 2018, a full grant application was submitted, and this was about 10 months of work, and we had actually gone through many different iterations of a study design with a budget of $6.56 million at the time. And I know that sounds like quite a bit of funding, but keep in mind that this was a study that from the beginning was supposed to last for a duration of 5 years and was supposed to include many different components, which included all of the scientific elements that I outlined earlier. So although we wanted to include every possible site in Canada, because of budgetary constraints, we were not able to, and had to settle on a design that included 5 sites that do represent quite nicely many different regions of Canada. Canada that I'll show you in a second. And we were able to come to a study design looking at specific patient populations that we thought represented the spectrum of MS, with an understanding that progression occurs even in the very earliest stages of MS and extends all the way to progressive subtypes of MS. So we submitted about a 1,500-page full grant application at the time. About a month later, we had a review with an international panel of experts, and we're very fortunate in July of 2018 to have been awarded $6.59 million over 5 years. In October of 2018, we were very fortunate because another industry funder, Roche Canada, contributed an additional $2 million. And then in the spring of 2019, CanProCo launched, and we started enrollment. In December of 2019, and this was actually at the last NDMS meeting in Calgary, the government of Alberta also contributed an additional $1 million. And then, like many studies around the world, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, all study activities were halted for a minimum of 6 months across all CanProCo sites. But despite the fact from the very beginning we had a bit of what we were told from the International Review Panel, an aggressive recruitment timeline and strategy, we were able to complete recruitment by February of 2022, and then very fortunate in April of 2022 to have been granted an additional $1.39 million to enroll the prior Canadian Pediatric Demyelinating Disease Network patients who are willing to come into Toronto and Montreal CanProCo sites. So that's where we've been at. And ultimately, the study design that we landed on was a prospective 5-year observational studies taking place at 5 Canadian academic research institutes with a number of additional sites involved in data analysis. And as you can see, these are the sites listed here, where we have representation from many parts of Canada. These names are all familiar to you, but this is what our scientific pillars look like, with pillar leads in neuroimaging, neuroimmunology, and epidemiology and health outcomes. Our study design, we already have a protocol paper published, and hopefully very soon we'll have our baseline characteristics manuscript published. But many of you have heard this already, but as you know, one of the strengths of CanProCo is that, again, from the very beginning, because we were tasked with designing a study that would include elements of many different, quite different scientific pillars, we have very detailed clinical data collection, but are also collecting research MRIs of the brain and cervical spinal cord. We are also collecting blood at each study visit, as well as cerebral spinal fluid in people who are getting spinal taps done for clinical reasons. In terms of our inclusion criteria, very briefly, again, at the beginning, we thought about many different versions of a study that would allow us to best understand mechanisms of progression in MS. And ultimately, this is the study population that we landed on, where we are recruiting people with radiologically isolated syndrome or imaging findings suggestive of MS, but who are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, as well as those with very early relapsing remitting MS and those with primary progressive MS. So as you can see, this is really a wide range of people with MS, but the goal of doing this was because there was a very clear understanding from the beginning of the design of CanProCo that progression is something that happens even in the very earliest stages of disease, maybe even in pre-symptomatic MS. So these are our inclusion criteria. And the scientific aims, again, are really to evaluate the wide spectrum of factors that are associated with clinical disease progression, both the onset and the rate of progression over 5 years, and to, importantly, assess how these factors relate to one another to cause progression in MS. And again, because of the wide range of data elements that we are collecting, specifically the factors of interest are really a wide range, which include, obviously, biological factors, but microstructural factors that we will evaluate using our detailed MRIs, demographic and clinical factors, environmental factors, and even health systems factors, because we do have the benefit of administrative data access at 3 out of our 5 CanProCo sites, which are in Alberta and British Columbia. Very importantly, one of the strengths of CanProCo as well is that we have integrative and exploratory aims, and we want to characterize the interactions and associations that occur between factors associated with onset and rate of progression in MS. And as many clinicians in the audience know, one of the greatest unmet needs we have in clinical practice is better tools to monitor progression in individual people living with MS. Our neurological exam, despite many benefits, has severe limitations when it comes to trying to accurately monitor progression. And so we're also exploring the use of novel data collection and analysis strategies to improve the assessment of progression in people with MS. So this is a brief summary of many of the data elements that we're collecting, and we do have a protocol paper published. For those of you interested, I would encourage you to take a look at that. But we are getting a wide range of clinical data, including a wide spectrum of patient-reported outcomes, which are summarized in this table here. We're getting both standardized clinical-grade MRIs as well as advanced MRIs of the brain and spinal cord, and evaluating a wide spectrum of biological factors, including both immune and non-immune mediated factors, and very exciting work, including RNA sequencing, and early results have already been reported for that. And again, we have health administrative data access in 2 of the provinces. We also are including technology-enabled data collection, which includes the MSPT device, which is kind of an electronic form of the MSFC that's administered and collected using an iPad. And then at the beginning of the study, we also had a smartphone application that was widely available for download called Floodlight Open. And unfortunately, this app has now been discontinued by the company, but we are now looking in phase 2 at other options where we may be able to facilitate digital data collection, because again, this is related to the recognition that we need better ways to clinically monitor progression in MS. So in terms of special things about CanProCo, it is one of the first national efforts that is directed specifically at understanding progression in MS. And because of the wide range of data that we're collecting, it allows collection and integration of data elements across very diverse scientific fields. We've also built data collection with the goal of eventually linking to other existing cohorts and databases around the world, which include MS Paths, which is a large multi-center cohort that already collects data using that iPad device I just told you about, MS Base, which is a huge international registry around the world, as well as the German Competence Network and the Pediatric Demyelinating Cohort. This is an example of a study that was made possible because of support from multiple funding sources, which include nonprofit agencies, government agencies, as well as industry partners. And last but not least, it's a uniquely Canadian effort. And I just wanted to highlight as well, I don't think there's many studies around the world where there are so many clinicians and scientists from across the country that have come together. And for me, a real learning point has been in all the discussions that we've had where, before CanProCo, I was very much tunnel vision focused on neuroimaging, but this study has actually allowed me to interact regularly with neuroimmunologists and epidemiologists, psychiatrists, and many other people that I would not necessarily usually have interacted with. So I think it's opened all of our minds to understanding the importance of the interaction between diverse scientific fields if we really are to get at the deeper understanding of progression in MS. So the eventual goal of all of this is really to develop better ways to treat progression in MS, which, as many of you know, is, again, one of the greatest unmet clinical needs in the field. So just a couple photos. This was at our CanProCo launch meeting at the beginning of 2019, which was before the pandemic. And we were very fortunate because for the first time in 4 years, and actually it was in nearly 5 years, we were able to have a CanProCo in-person investigator meeting in September of this year. And I purposely didn't put the photos side by side because we don't necessarily want to see how people have changed over the last 4 to 5 years. This is a slide just summarizing our research staff, and these are the people that are, the face of CanProCo at every single site, and that make CanProCo run smoothly. And these are 2 tables summarizing all of our co-investigators, which include really many people from around the country, and a list of many of our collaborators, which include additional people from around the country, but also internationally. CanProCo also has the benefit of having an international scientific advisory board, and these are many names that many of you will recognize. And each of these individuals have been selected specifically because they have expertise in different cohort studies and different aspects of CanProCo, and where we've benefited greatly from their regular advice. So just what has happened since all of that. In February of 2022, we completed enrollment. We did have a total of nearly 950 participants enrolled in the study, but like many cohort studies, now that we're nearing the 5-year mark, we had about 10% attrition, which I'm told is quite good for a longitudinal cohort study, but we are doing everything that we can to minimize additional attrition. And currently, we have about 840 actively enrolled participants. In terms of the demographic summary, hopefully you'll be seeing this published relatively soon, but just wanted to highlight that it is a pretty typical cohort of early relapsing MS as well as primary progressive MS. And just wanted to highlight that because CanProCo was recruited at 5 of the largest Canadian cities, in comparison to existing cohorts around the world, although it's still not a huge amount of diversity, when you look at the racial and ethnic distribution, we have approximately 20% non-Caucasian, which is something to be proud of, just because when you look at other cohorts around the world, for instance, the Scottish cohort that was recently reported, as well as an Australian cohort and the German cohort, they achieve maybe 1 to 2% diversity. So I think this is something that is noteworthy and that we should be proud of as Canadians. In terms of study progression, because of the staggered enrollment, not everyone is at the same stage of the study, but most people have completed year 3 study visit, and many people are nearing the end of year 5. So we're looking to phase 2 so that we can hopefully increase the follow-up duration to a minimum of 8 to 10 years. Attrition, I've already told you about. We've had about 10% and really doing everything that we can to minimize it. And then, I don't want to go over this in too much detail. We have been very productive and likely will be even more productive in the years to come. This is a list of our grants and awards, abstracts and platform presentations. So at every single major scientific meeting having to do with MS in the last 2 years, there have been multiple CanProCo submissions, and many of them have been acknowledged as oral presentations, and some of them have even been awarded top awards for highest ranked abstracts. Just wanted to give you an idea of some of the manuscripts that have already been published, as you can see here. So a lot of the health economics and productivity data have already emerged, and just wanted to highlight that one of the early papers looking at productivity loss that was led by Larry Lind and his group has been used on many occasions to advocate to governments for additional funding for people with MS, because this study looked at workplace productivity, and despite the fact that the majority of our study consists of people within 1 to 2 years of diagnosis, there's very clearly productivity loss, not always in the form of absenteeism, which is when people are not at work, but presenteeism, which is when they're there, but not necessarily functioning as effectively as they think they would have without symptoms related to MS. In addition, even at this meeting, you're going to see a lot of CanProCo abstracts looking at advanced MRI findings, as well as very novel biological findings, including results from some of the early results looking at single-cell RNA sequencing, as well as protein biomarker discovery. And I don't want to steal the thunder of many of our trainees who are presenting here at END-MS. We also, in order to have patients really feel a connection to CanProCo and to minimize attrition in the coming years, have developed CanProCo merch. And I just couldn't help myself. I wanted to show you this because I am so delighted to have CanProCo merch. And you'll probably see some of this and our logo at different posters. We've also engaged our patients and have had CanProCo patient education days that have been attended by over 400 participants. And we're hoping that we'll be able to integrate some in-person participation in the coming days. And then we've also established a patient expert group and had the first panel discussion discussion at our CanProCo investigator meeting because we are looking to increase CanProCo participant feedback, whether it is with study visits or logistics, analysis priorities, and how to best disseminate study results. And so we are planning to continue to integrate regular engagement of our participants in the years to come. We also had the great fortune of being able to get funding so that we can integrate the pediatric onset MS cohort. So this is the CPDDN that many of you know about, led by Brenda Banwell and Amit Bar-Or. But in these patients who are now adults, when they have been willing, we are now bringing them into CanProCo sites in Toronto and Montreal so that we can have long-term follow-up of some of these pediatric patients. We are also looking, and this was one of the mandates of CanProCo from the beginning, to share data widely around the world. We do have a data access scheme with the full understanding that this is a living document that will continuously change. We have a data management committee, and right now, CanProCo data access is limited to CanProCo key investigators, but we will be opening access more widely to CanProCo investigators and collaborators in the coming year. And we have many data access requests coming in. This year alone, we've had about 15, and so it's very clear to do this effectively, we will actually need dedicated funding and dedicated personnel so that we can do this. So what's next? In terms of phase 2 of CanProCo funding, we are working very closely with MS Canada, and I'm looking at Pam Valentine and Pam Connellis right now as I say this. But we are hoping we'll be able to raise some funding to allow us to continue CanProCo follow-up, ideally up to 10 years. We know that there's a huge amount of data, and we need to know how to best integrate these data to perform complex analyses. We're looking to involve more Canadian MS centers and investigators, and even thinking about things like a dedicated funding competition where investigators in Canada may apply to use CanProCo data. Again, we're looking at this open science platform and looking to have funding to support that because there clearly is a lot of interest in Canada and beyond. We've already established some international collaborations, including with the German Competence Network, MS Paths, as well as the Canadian Pediatric Study. We're looking to enhance patient engagement, and so we'll be working closely with MS Canada to try to facilitate this in the coming year. So in terms of the future, clearly, much progress has been made, but we know that there's a lot of work to be done. And in the years to come, we're going to be focusing on patient retention, these complex analyses that integrate methods from very diverse scientific fields. With a study like this, governance is always something that we're looking at and looking to modify over time. Data sharing is a big priority and linkages to some of these existing studies that I've already told you about. Ongoing funding is always going to be a challenge, but I'm optimistic and hopeful because I think even with some of these early results, it's demonstrating to be a really valuable cohort. And we hope that over time, we'll be able to contribute to address, again, one of the greatest unmet needs for people living in Canada and beyond. So with that, I'd like to thank, first and foremost, our study participants. It's incredible how willing people living with MS have been to devoting, hours, often an entire day, to attend study visits. And so this study would not be possible without the tireless efforts of our patients. The CanProCo team, and I see many of them sitting around the room here, it's been wonderful working together for the last number of years, and I look forward to continuing to work together. Our funders, and this study was really spearheaded by the efforts of MS Canada, so I really can't do it without you, and thank you for all your efforts, and look forward to working with you about phase 2, as well as many of our other partners that are listed here. The Canadian Pediatric Demyelinating Disease Network, we have this new exciting integration, and look forward to telling you more about that in the years to come, and of course, all of you, the Canadian MS community. Thank you very much for your attention.